So, good evening, everybody. The Archaeological Society Malta and the Department of Classics and Archaeology are very pleased to welcome you to this, our sixth in the series of talks for 2020-2021. A particularly warm welcome to our participants from overseas, and I see that they're quite numerous. We have Germany, UK, Ireland, of course, represented, and probably others that I haven't managed to see on the participant list. For those who don't know me, I'm Patricia Camilleri, President of the Archaeological Society Malta, and as usual, I shall be mediating this evening's session. I would like to ask you to make sure that you mute yourselves so that we don't have echo issues or noises off, as we all know by now often happens in video links. So just a reminder that this is recorded and the use of your own video is of course totally optional. All of this season's lectures are a collaboration between the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Malta and the Archaeological Society Malta. Thanks are therefore always owing to the head of department, Dr. John C. Betts, and to Professor Nicholas Vella, ASM Vice President, who is really our link between the Society and the department. So just a word of explanation about how we shall proceed this evening. I'll be introducing our guest speaker, Catriona Brogan, then turning the virtual floor over to her. Please do ask your questions using the chat, which you can access either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what device you're using. Anytime during the talk, you can put in a question anytime, and I shall be monitoring those questions as we go along. And then at the end, I shall ask Catriona to kindly answer at least a few of those questions at the end as time allows. This evening's lecture is entitled A Potted History, Malta's Earliest Pottery. Just a few words about our guest speaker. Dr. Catriona Brogan completed her PhD at Queen's University Belfast in 2015. Her thesis examined the placement of the burial structures within the landscape in relation to important natural resources, and also examined how these funerary landscapes evolved and changed over time through the application of GIS, the Geographic Information Systems. After receiving her PhD, she joined the European Research Council funded Fraxus project. She was actively involved in the Fraxus project fieldwork, helping to supervise excavations at the temple sites of Gigantia and Santa Verna, correct myself, in Gozo, and Cordine 3 and Scorba in Malta. Catriona also served as one of the Fraxus project's pottery specialists, identifying, organizing, and analyzing the pottery record. She has contributed to a number of papers produced by the Fraxus project, and also helped write several chapters in Temple Places, Excavating Cultural Sustainability in Prehistoric Malta, which was published in 2020. She has presented on pottery findings at several conferences and also worked closely with the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta to produce an exhibition detailing the Fraxus project's results. In 2018, Dr. Brogan obtained the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions Individual Fellowship funding for the Malta Pot project. This 2-year project combined traditional archaeological approaches with more scientific techniques to achieve a more detailed understanding of Malta's early Neolithic pottery fabrics. So without further ado, over to you, Catriona.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And yes, just like to say basically that the project for the last 2 years, from 2018 until 2021, I was part of the Malta Pot project. And firstly, I'd like to thank the Archaeological Society of Malta and the Department of Classics and Archaeology for inviting me to give this talk to you today. And I would like to extend a special thanks to Anne, Patricia in the Society, and also Nick at the university for being so helpful in organising this. And I would also like to thank all of you for attending this meeting. I hope that you find it interesting, and I hope that you find it informative. And then, as an Irish person, I wouldn't be doing my national duty if I didn't wish you a happy St. Patrick's Day. So from Ireland, happy St. Patrick's Day. Okay, so just to cover the basics of the project, basically the talk today will present the initial results from the Malta Pot project. This was a 2-year funded Marie Curie project based at the University of Malta with the Department of Classics and Archaeology under Dr. Betts as a coordinator. And although we also worked extensively with the Faculty of Engineering and other departments within the university. Within Malta itself, we had 2 partner organisations, which were Heritage Malta and the Superintendents of Cultural Heritage. These 2 organisations provided us with support, analysis, and also material for analysis. So I'd like to thank them for all of their cooperation. And then it should probably also mention that this project actually developed out of my work with the Fraxis project, as Patricia has mentioned, in which I was studying the ceramics. And this is somewhere else where we obtained material, ceramic material for the Malta Pot project. So the main aim of the project was to ascertain if we could increase our knowledge of Malta's earliest cultures through an in-depth systematic study of the ceramic record. Our 2 main areas of study were the pottery fabrics and then also the provenance of the raw materials used to produce these vessels. Unfortunately, I should probably mention this at the start, unfortunately the final stages of the project were affected by the COVID pandemic, and as a result the analysis is still ongoing. So while we were funded up until 2021, we are basically still analysing a lot of the data that's come through, just because of access to machines and people's time and all the rest of it. So the talk today is mainly going to focus on the results of the fabric characterization, specifically the petrology results, and then we'll make a brief mention of the provenance studies, although we still have quite a lot of work to do with this, so I'll only be briefly touching on that. So in this first section, I want to define the time frame that we're looking at in the project, and also at how previous pottery studies have influenced our understanding of early Malta. For the purposes of the project, we are focusing on the first 3 phases of Malta's prehistory, so the Ardalam, Scorba and Sabuj phase. And well, the Ardalam and Scorba phase generally are conventionally termed as early Neolithic. The Sabuj phase itself sometimes gets grouped in as early Temple period. It kind of straddles this period between the early Neolithic and then the developed Temple period, whenever all of the temples, the big megalithic structures, began to be constructed. So this period, these 3 periods, form a very interesting time in Malta's history. They basically cover the arrival of Malta's first permanent settlers up to the construction of the megalithic complexes. It's also during this initial phase that Malta is regarded as being well connected to its central Mediterranean neighbours. So the archaeological record, including the pottery record, suggests that there was quite a lot of contact between Malta and its neighbouring central Mediterranean neighbours. So, and then during the temple period, it becomes slightly more insular. So this appears to be when the islands are well connected. Much is still unknown about this period of Malta's early history. The archaeological record contains few structural remains. So really the only known structures that we have from the Ardalan period come from Scorba, the excavations at Scorba, and what we have here is partially excavated remains of a hut, and very few artifacts were found within that hut. I think it had been cleared probably before in prehistoric times. Then during the Scorba period, the only structural remains that we really have relate to the enigmatic red Scorba shrine. So very few and far between as well. And then the remains for the Sabuj period, once again at Scorba, we have the remains of hut circles. And then during this period, this is whenever we start to see the emergence of formal burials on the island. So what we have here are rock cut tombs, and this one is from Catriona. So this is where the burials would have been. So the lack of definitive structural sites means that the artifactual record has acquired a special significance. And this is especially true for the pottery record, as it's the most common artifact recovered from archaeological digs and accounts for the vast majority of artifacts in the archaeological record. So while the known structures are very scarce, the pottery sherds have been recovered from a substantial number of sites across the island, and they're quite widespread. The symbols here relate to the solid structures are the pottery from the different phases, and then the starred asterisks, those are the clay samples that we took, but for the purposes of this slide, it's these three symbols that are important. So in the first half of the 20th century, many important archaeological sites, including many of the temple complexes, were excavated, and this resulted in a huge volume of pottery being recovered. In order to make sense of Malta's complex and diverse pottery record, archaeologists turned to typology. So traditional typology relies on grouping artifacts together based on their primary attributes or physical properties. So this goes on stuff like their shape and the decoration used, so you can put things that are stylistically similar together into groups. So although the early 20th century is a very active period for excavation across the Maltese Isles, it wasn't really until the 1950s that the first attempt was made to put some order, bring some order to the pottery record. So in 1953, Evans created the first typology of the pottery. This was not perfect. He got some of the pottery phases in the wrong order, and he also mixed up some of the types. So it was a good start, but it needed refining. So Evans' work was then augmented by Trump's excavations at Scorba, where the newly discovered Scorba pottery was added to the existing pottery record. And also the site of Scorba gave them the unique opportunity because it had these wonderfully intact stratigraphic layers, which basically had each phase nicely cemented one on top of the other. And so this helped to provide a relative chronology for the islands. This was the first relative chronology, and it helped to establish the order in which the different pottery phases appeared. And then finally, Evans went back to this work and just kind of tidied it up again in the 1970s. So the well-defined pottery traditions also made it easier for them to then identify, or for archaeologists to identify, similarities between Malta's pottery and those of its neighbouring areas. So this allowed the archaeologists to observe cultural affiliations between Malta and the wider central Mediterranean region. So as we can see from this table here, each of the first 3 phases shares similarities. There's contemporary cultures in Sicily and then the Aeolian Islands, but the pottery record in Malta has generally been linked. It's got its closest affiliations with Sicily itself. So just to give you a brief idea, I'm sure that you're all very aware of these cultural links, but basically for the Ardalan periods, in the 1950s, Ardalan pottery was recognised as belonging to the impressed ware culture, a pottery tradition that was widespread across the whole of the Mediterranean, although it was most reminiscent of the Sicilian Stintinello ware. So as you can see from the images here, they both employ these sort of lines, these geometric patterns and lines, and there's also quite strong similarities between the forms that are observed between the 2 areas. And of course this makes sense because now it's widely accepted that Malta's earliest settlers derived from Sicily. They made the crossing and came to Malta. Sorry, just lost my pointer. Oh. Okay. Okay, sorry. So then for the Scorba period, we see it's during the late 5th and early 4th millennium BC, the impressed pottery tradition was replaced across the whole of the Mediterranean by this much plainer monochrome ware. On Malta, this change is represented by the Scorba pottery, and the Scorba pottery is particularly reminiscent of the Diana Bella Vista ware, which is found throughout much of Italy and Sicily. So this is especially true for the red Scorba pottery, which employs this distinctive red slip. And this was also widely used in the Diana Bella Vista ware, and also the trumpet lugs that we see in the Diana Bella Vista ware pottery are also commonly used in the Scorba pottery from Malta. And then finally, for the Sabuge period, the highly decorated Sabuge pottery, basically it resembles the Sancono or Sancono Pianonetero ware from Sicily, which we can see here the similarities in form is very striking, and they also use quite a few of the same decorative motifs. And then we have in the Sabuge period a special type of pottery which seems to be reminiscent of the Trefontaine ware that is found in Sicily. The Trefontaine ware employs this distinctive triangular motif with cross-hatching in it, and then the use of these wavy lines. Whenever we get to the Maltese pottery, it's somewhat softened, but you can still see this basic triangular shape with the cross-hatching, and then below it the use of the wavy lines. So as we can see, the typological studies of the Maltese pottery has contributed significantly to our understanding of this period, helping to differentiate between the different pottery groups. And it's also provided the first relative chronology for the islands, and it's also helped to highlight the cultural links between Malta and its central Mediterranean neighbours. However, we still have very little knowledge about these pots beyond their physical appearance. So fabric descriptions generally tend to be very subjective, and there's no real consensus about the types of fabric in use during each of the period. So what we generally tend to get are these quite brief descriptions of the fabrics that are available. So it will just normally give a color, whether it's a rough kind of coarse wear or if it's fine. But this, like I said, there's no consensus, so this will vary from source to source. And this makes it really quite difficult for archaeologists then to talk about the fabric, because there is no consensus. It gets quite easy to get confused between different fabrics. So what can we do to address this problem? Well, in order to fix the fabric problem, we need to go beyond the surface and look at the fabric itself. So traditional typological studies, of course, are an essential step in our understanding of any pottery record, especially one as vast and diverse as that of prehistoric Malta. Because the typologies here are so well understood, it's now possible for us to delve a bit deeper into the pottery record by looking at the fabrics, so we don't have to put in the groundwork. It's already been done. The Multipot project basically used two approaches in order to study the fabrics. So first of all, we have just the general fabric characterization, and then we have provenance studies. So we'll just talk a bit about those in the next couple of slides. So with fabric characterization, it relies on identifying both the materials from which the fabric is made, which is the qualitative aspect of it. So what materials can we see within the pot? So we have to try and figure out what all of these separate components of the sherd are. And then we also look at the quantitative aspects of it. So these are measurable things. So whenever we're looking at this, we can basically have a look at how densely these inclusions are distributed through it, the sort of size of the inclusions, and all of these things that we can measure then help us to get a more nuanced picture and to help us better describe the actual pottery itself. And so once you have characterized the different components of a fabric, you can then start to group sherds with similar compositions together into fabric groups. So this is very similar. In fact, it's a typological study of the fabrics rather than the surface designs. So in reality, we're just sort of extending what was done in the past and applying it to the inside of the vessel. So for us, well, one of the main questions is, well, why is it worth doing a fabric characterization? What are the sort of archaeological questions it can actually answer for us? So at a very basic level, the fabric characterization, as we've already said, allows us to identify what materials the potters were using to make their pottery, so the clays and other materials. And then we can differentiate between different fabrics. And then we can group similar fabrics together to make these reference groups. This is very useful for somewhere like prehistoric Malta, where we don't have any production sites. So it allows us to basically establish reference groups. So whenever we find new pottery, instead of linking it to a production site per se, we can link it to a group of sherds that we've already analysed. And we can also glean aspects of how the sherds were made. So whenever you look at the sherds and you analyse them, you can tell certain aspects such as the firing temperature and the firing atmosphere by actually just looking at the sherds and what's in them, how the material within the sherds has changed on heating. And then it can also help us to determine the function of vessels. So while one of the primary indicators of function is the vessel form, so obviously certain groups or certain shapes are better suited to certain functions. So you may have a pouring jug or a serving platter, storage jar. The form of it makes it quite obvious what these were initially intended to be used for. But sometimes the fabric itself can give us some ideas, and this is especially good if we have very fragmented or the forms aren't clear. So potters will often add specific tempers to make the vessel more suitable for a specific task. So sometimes the material that's added can help strengthen the vessel, or it can give it waterproof qualities. And if we can determine if these things have been deliberately added, it may help us to say something more about the intended function of the vessel. And then lastly, it can also give us some idea about the cultural identity of those making the pots. So it's well accepted that many cultures express identity through material culture. For example, they use certain forms and motifs to either differentiate or affiliate themselves with specific cultural groups. And in a way, sometimes the pottery can be used in a similar fashion. So some cultures will say have very conservative fabrics and they'll keep using it, but it's very specific to them, so they don't change it very much. Or if you just think about how pottery itself is actually produced, how it's taught and produced, it can be handed down through the generations. And so in this way, the fabric can be an indicator of cultural identity too. So we are also aiming to look at the provenance of the material used. And basically, provenance is concerned with identifying the source of the raw materials used by the potters. And the general premises behind it is that the chemical composition of the pot will largely represent the chemical composition of the material from which it's made. And so in order to do this, it relies on comparing the clays present in the pottery samples to the clays in the landscape. Sometimes this can give us very specific locations. Some areas have very high geological variation, where one clay outcrop will be significantly different from its neighbour. Although sometimes if you have an area where the geology is quite similar, and this can happen over quite large areas, then it's difficult to differentiate between these clay sources. So it may be then difficult to actually identify provenance or to tie it down to a specific clay outcrop or area. So much the same as the fabric analysis, obviously provenance has a wider significance. So as well as answering where were they getting their raw materials from, it can also shed light on how Malta's earliest potters were using their landscape. So if we are lucky enough to be able to draw out detailed provenances for some of the clays and able to match them to some of the vessels, it may give us an idea of which outcrops they were accessing, if they're ones that were avoided, or just generally how they were obtaining or where they were obtaining their material from. So it's often been noted that most potters stay relatively local to get their clays, so within a few kilometres of the production site, and then often they travel maybe slightly further to get the timber that they add to it. And then finally, the provenance may also help us answer questions about trade in this early period of Malta's history, because basically if we find pottery sherds that contain non-local material, then this may indicate that trade was taking place, we do already know that material was coming in to Malta during this period, during the Ardalam, Scorba and Sabuge phase. And we know that during the Sabuge phase there's even been Sabuge pottery found on Sicily itself. So it's highly likely that there is some form of interaction taking place between Malta and its neighbours. So as you can see, there's still a lot of information to be gleaned from the pottery sherds, and there's potential to add to the story of early Neolithic Malta. So much of our knowledge about this period is still based on the typological studies that were formulated over, say, about 50 years ago. But in Malta, in the last few decades, there's been an increasing number of archimetric pottery or scientific pottery studies conducted. The majority of these studies have focused on the late Neolithic, so we're looking at the Temple period or even beyond that into the Bronze Age whenever we're looking at prehistoric stuff. So only 3 studies include the early Neolithic period, which is Molitor, Pirani and Peroni. And out of these, only Pirani was specifically concerned with creating a detailed record of the ceramic fabric, and this related specifically to the Scorba phase. This means that there's still quite a lot that we can add to the story of the early pots. So we can look at, well, basically they need a detailed record, so we need to kind of extend what Pirani has done. So for the Malta Pot project itself, initially we sampled 381 sherds for analysis, just to give us material that we thought represented the 3 different phases and also the different kinds of contexts in which we find them. So generally this was from material that had been excavated from underneath temple sites and so forth, but with the Sabuge material we are actually lucky enough to have Catriona and the Shara hypogeum, which are both related to funerary activity during this period. So on the left we have a breakdown of the different samples. So we collected 64 Ardalam samples, 90 Scorba samples and 227 Sabuge samples. As already stated, all of these were taken from excavated sites and where possible from secure contexts. So once we had collected our large sample, it became apparent that this is quite a lot of material to be working with, and we also didn't really have a very good picture of the fabrics. So generally what you get after you excavate material and you clean it, the potsherd, the section will look something like this. And so as you can see, this is quite a homogeneous looking grey surface. It's difficult really to identify anything within it. So in order to get a better idea of the different fabrics that each period had, we decided that we needed to grind a flat surface on each of the sherds. And then this allowed us a much better view of the fabric itself. So this is the same sherd before and after grinding, and with this one you can start to see the dark core, the lighter margins, and we can begin to see some of, well, we can see the clays and the material within the sherd itself. So the once we'd done this, then we subsampled or initial 381, we reduced it down to 56 samples. So we had 18 sherds for Cebuge, 14 for Scorba, and 24 for, sorry, 18 Ardalan, I think it's Cebuge, 14 Scorba, and 24 Cebuge. And these samples that we took were deemed to be the most representative of the different fabrics present within each of the 3 phases. For each of these, we tried to get, so it's not 18 individual fabrics, we basically tried to get at least 3 sherds of the same fabric for each fabric type, just so that we had a bit of comparison between sherds. And then the subsamples were then subjected to various types of analysis, but essentially all of the analysis was concerned with identifying the components from which the sherds were made, so that we can then see if the fabric groups identified were real or if there were new sort of classifications, new fabric groups. So this gives you, this is an up-close image of the actual fabric of a sherd, and you can see, just like a cake, each pottery sherd has its own distinct recipe. The main ingredient of every sherd is made out of clay, so it forms the bulk of the pottery vessel, and in this sample it can be seen as this orange background to everything. But it also contains a number of different inclusions. So generally, inclusions can either be naturally present. So whenever we talk about naturally present inclusions, this can be stuff like fossils or organic material or stones, just stuff that's naturally incorporated into the clay. And often this stuff, unless the clay is very purified and sieved and cleaned, at least some of this stuff will remain within the sherd. And then the other type of inclusion is called temper, and this is an example of temper. This is a piece of chamot, which is broken down old sherds of pottery, which have been ground down and then just added to the clay mix. And so these deliberately added inclusions are often referred to as temper. And so common tempers include things like limestones, shells, but you can also get stuff that is seemingly natural in its origin, such as organic matter and sand. So it's up to the archaeologist to try and determine what has been added as temper and what is a naturally occurring inclusion. And then basically the main reason why the potter will add temper is generally to improve the strength of the clay whenever they are working it, drying it and firing it. And then, as we've also discussed previously, temper can often be added to the pot in order to alter the finished properties of the fired vessel. So it can make it either stronger, waterproof, or whatever, depending on the actual temper added. So whenever we started our scientific analysis of the sherds, generally the methods that we were using analysed the results that they gave us out were either compounds or elements. And for example, you can look at the same sherd using 2 different techniques, and then depending on their output and what they are designed to analyze, they'll give you a slightly different story. So what we get with the first technique is pottery sherd will identify this red dot as calcite, and then you may get a different technique, or we can use a different technique which analyzes the elements. So instead of calcite, it breaks it down into the various elements that calcite is made of, and it often gives you the relative amounts of these as well. So basically, to take you through the different techniques that we involved, so I'll cover the ones that give us sort of compounds, or in this case kind of minerals first. So the core of our fabric characterization is based on the petrology analysis, and this was actually conducted by Claudio Capelli at the University of Genoa. And for this, you use thin section slides of the pottery. So what we have here is a very, very thin slither of pottery, and it's actually 0.3 millimeters thick. So this is really very fine and allows the light to pass through it. And then this is analysed underneath a microscope, and it allows somebody who's an expert like Claudio to identify what all of the different components in the potsherd are. So, for example, these very angular white inclusions, these are calcite fragments, and it looks like they've been crushed because of this very sharp angular shape that they have. Generally, whenever you get natural inclusions, the edges tend to be a bit softer, a bit rounder, because there's a bit of erosion has happened within the landscape, whereas these look like they were freshly crushed and then added to the clay mix. So one of the major benefits of this is because it allows us to look at the whole sherd, and it gives us a good idea of the overall impression of the fabric. So we can look at stuff like the size of the inclusions, we can look at how they are distributed throughout the fabric, and then this allows us to compare it to other sherds and build a better idea of how each of the different fabric groups look and what their composition is. Then we also used X-ray diffraction, commonly known as XRD for short. And this is something else that gives us the compounds. So basically, unlike the petrology analysis, in which you are analysing essentially a full, complete section of the pottery sherd, for the purposes of the X-ray diffraction, the pottery has to be ground up into a very fine powder, and then this is then analysed with the X-rays. I'll not go into all of this because it's quite complicated and the science is pretty much beyond me half the time, but essentially what it does is it identifies, well, it produces a spectrum along which we have the different minerals that are present within the sample. So the XRD spectrum has a series of peaks, and each compound normally has a number of peaks. It's represented by several peaks, and these can be identified through their position along the spectrum. So often what we get is, say, this one is quartz, this peak relates to quartz, as does this one, as does this one and this one, I think, all with the Qs. So basically, whenever we have a sample that matches up to this, we know that quartz is present within the fabric. Then we also use X-ray fluorescence, and basically this gives us the elemental oxides present within each pottery or clay sample. And once again, you can use this either, you can use a resin mount, which you basically have a small piece of pottery mounted within a resin platform, and basically the resin mounts are quite good for very friable pottery like the prehistoric stuff because it helps to stabilize them. But the X-ray fluorescence then identifies the different oxides that are present within the sample, and also their relative percent as well. And finally, the last method that we used is the electron microscope with energy dispersive spectroscopy. And this particular method is useful as it allows you to place a thin section slide underneath the microscope, under the scanning electron microscope, and it brings up this black and white image of the pottery sherd that you're wanting to analyze. Now, this is very good if you are wanting to target in on specific areas. So if you see something that looks quite interesting within your sherd and you wonder what it is, you can then target specific areas. So such as this large white inclusion, if you want to see what it's made of, what elements are present here. But generally for our purpose, what we were trying to do is to take a large sample sized area, and that was representative of the makeup of the sherd as a whole, and then this allowed us to compare these sort of general targeted area, or these general areas, to each other, so that we could form an idea of different fabric groups. So the sort of readout that you get with the EDS, it basically as well gives you a spectrum, and then you have a series of peaks that occur along it, and it will tell you which elements they are. So got silicon, calcium, titanium, iron, etc. And then it gives you a weighted percent. So this just gives you quite a detailed understanding of what elements are present and in what quantities. Then all of this analysis essentially is designed to tell us what is in the sherds and in what quantity, so that we can then go forward and identify fabric groups. So once the archaeologist knows what ingredients or what materials are in the sherds, they can then use this information to link together the sherds into fabric groups. So even if the outward appearance of the sherds is seemingly quite different, it allows us to identify what the vessels were made from, and then the sherds that share the same recipe are linked somehow. So this could be that there was just a general convention about how you made the pottery in a specific area, or it may in a way, or it may in some cases be slightly dictated by what materials are available. But as well as that, it can kind of also point to stuff like it could have been made by the same workshop or the same family. So this is really the start of our reference groups for the pottery. And obviously, because we are dealing with handmade materials and natural materials, there'll always be some variation within these fabric groups. So not every sherd is going to be a carbon copy of the last, but they all basically share the same materials in roughly the same quantities. And then, like I say, with the provenance studies, we're just going to touch on it briefly, but I'll just tell you the basics of what we've done for the provenance studies. So in addition to the fabric characterization, we wanted to assess if we could identify the local clay sources. And we all know that the Maltese Islands are very rich in clay. So across Gozo, there are lots of clay outcrops, and then down the west coast of Malta itself, once again, you get these very large outcrops, and you even get some smaller outcrops along the coast. So it does seem there is obviously a lot of natural clay available. And we do have historic evidence to suggest that Maltese potters used local clays. So within quite recent history, I think, people have used the clays from here to make pottery vessels. So this tells us that the clays here are suitable for pottery production. But what we need to then do is prove that the sherds that we have found from Ardalam, Scorbat and Sabuge period were actually using local clays. So in order to do this, we have to take the pottery samples and then obtain clay samples and then compare the two of them to see if they match. So one of the issues that we noted in the literature is that past studies generally only compare pottery samples to a small number of potential clay sources. And generally, these clay sources are located in Malta. So quite a few of the studies, they just tend to focus on the Maltese clays, and normally only a couple of Maltese clays at that. So we thought that given the number of obvious and easily accessible clay outcrops in Gozo, combined with the number of archaeological sites and the amount of pottery that's been found there, we thought that this was something that we should perhaps take a closer look at. And so to this end, the project went out and sampled 7 sites, all in Gozo. And then to this, we also then added 6 sites from Malta, which were sampled by a previous study that had been based at the university. So in total, this gives us quite a good picture of the different clay outcrops that are present across the 2 islands. So although this is sort of a result, I'll just mention it here quickly because I'm not really going to discuss the provenance studies in the actual results. So from this, we've been able to look at the clay fabrics, and this one is the XRF, which gives us the oxides, the elemental oxides. And as you can see, each of these outcrops is quite different in its composition. So hopefully the plan is that we should then be able to relate the pottery sherds that we have subsampled to some of these clays. So as I already said at the start of the presentation, this, because of the COVID pandemic, the project is behind schedule and analysis is still ongoing. So the results that are presented here are mainly going to focus on just the petrology results. And yeah, so hopefully we should have more answers soon. So with each, with the Ardalam period potsherds, we were able to identify 5 distinct fabrics. Of these 3 were fine wares. So this is 1, 2, and 4, while 2 were associated with coarse wares. So these are more coarse fabrics. Generally, the Ardalam pottery seems to be tempered with calcium carbonates. So we have stuff appearing in them, well, like limestones and the biocalcarenites, spathic calcites. So these are the sort of things that would have been found in, these are derived from the limestones themselves. And then we also have material which is naturally occurring. So we have stuff like the foraminifera, which are these single-celled organisms with shells, which we can see here. But yeah, so the overall feel of the Ardalam fabrics is that they generally tend to have a lot of calcium carbonates in them. So we decided that it might be useful as well then to try and link the internal fabrics with the external appearance. And generally with the Ardalan fabrics, the three main styles of pottery that you find are this sort of very highly burnished black fine ware, which has often geometric designs on it. And what we find from this is that it was only associated with one fabric, which was the fine ware. And it was also the most common fabric that we have. Then we looked at the other fabrics that we have, and basically all of the fine wares were used to construct this type of Ardalan pottery, which is quite a common ware or quite a common style. Basically, it tends to be grey or a reddy brown in colour, and it's often highly decorated as well. And so this kind of accounts for the other fine ware fabrics. And then lastly, we have these sort of coarse vessels, which tend to be very thick, and often the decoration on them is quite coarsely executed. And with these, rather unsurprisingly, perhaps they are associated with the two courseware fabrics that we identified. The nature of the Ardalan pottery unfortunately means that a lot, or well, the nature of the Ardalan pottery is quite crushed, it's quite fragmented, so it means that it's difficult to often identify forms and shapes, but we thought that we would try to identify forms and then link it to the fabric as well, just to see which fabrics they were using for which vessels. Unfortunately for the Ardalan period, the number of vessel forms that we could identify was very limited. So basically, fabric one, once again, our most common fabric in the Ardalan sherds, was associated with these globular jars, these necked globular jars. And then the only other one that we could really tie to any form was fabric 5, which once again was associated with this globular. So this is actually a courseware being used to make this vessel, which I don't know, I suppose it is slightly surprising, but see. And then just to quickly take you through the fabrics and where they occurred, we have fabric 1 occurred on both islands, so seems to it appeared in Santa Verna and Scorba. Then fabrics 2, 3, 4 and 5 were all found on Gozo. Just a slight caveat for these, because we had a limited number of sites sampled and a limited number of sherds sampled, so this isn't really indicative of their actual spread across the whole islands, but for now it just gives us a rough idea of the general areas in which we can say they were found. So going through to the Scorba pottery now, we find 4 distinct fabrics. We have fabrics 1, 2 and 3 all appear to be related to fine wares, while fabric 4, with its large fragments of calcite, relates to courseware. Within our sherds, the most common type of fabric was fabric 1, which seems to be full of forams by biocalcarnates, and it's also got minor coralline algae and organic material, which can be seen, unfortunately not in this sherd, but if you get sort of black areas, it suggests where an organic has burnt away, and it seems to be quite well fired. So like fabric 1, the other 2 Scorba fine wares both seem to have coralline algae present in them, and also sometimes as well the organics. The presence of this coralline algae isn't really seen in the Ardalan phase pottery, and only very rarely in the Sebouge. So this kind of sets the Scorba fabrics apart from the other 2 phases. Then whenever we look at the styles in which the fabrics are used with or associated with, so conventionally scorba pottery is divided into the grey and the red scorba. The grey scorba pottery tends to be very plain, smoothed and devoid of decoration. The scorba or red scorba ware is similarly devoid of decoration, maybe slightly more so than the grey, but it doesn't really occur very often. But what defines it is the bright red slip that covers the surface of it. So the fabric analysis suggests that although the grey and red scorba have very distinct surface appearances, the same fabrics were generally used for both types of wear. So there's no real differentiation between the fabrics used to manufacture either of these. And once again, whenever we try to look and identify forms, the most common fabric, which I suppose makes sense because we have most of our samples relate to them, but it gives us, it seems to have been used across a wide range of forms as well. So it seemed to be seeing a lot of different vessels produced from this material. Then the other two fine wares, we were a bit more limited in what they could tell us. So basically fabric 2 is associated with this jar, whereas fabric 3 is associated with a pedestal bowl. And then for fabric 4, which is the courseware, we have it being used to produce this neck jar, and then also quite surprisingly for the pedestal bowls, because these generally tend to be quite fine walled vessels, so it's quite surprising to see the coarser fabric used for that. And then it's occurrence across the islands. Fabric 1, we find it on both sites from both islands, whereas fabric 2 and 3, sorry, both, we've only found evidence of them so far on Malta. And then finally the courseware has shown up at Santa Verna, Tacharla and Cordine 3, so it's we know that it's on both islands. Then finally, to look at this bouge fabric, we identified 5 main fabric groups. The reason why I have 6 is because I've actually thought that it was quite pertinent to include fabric 2.1. And fabric 2.1 is, I don't know, I would almost argue that it could be put into a bracket by itself, and it represents a type of pottery known as peregrine ware, which we find in Cebuge. So I've just singled this one out just for extra mention. So basically for the Cebuge, we have fabrics 1, 2, 4, and 5. These are all fine to intermediate wares, whereas 2.1, 3 and 5 are coarse wares. The fine ware timber, or most common type of fabric within the Cebuge material, is fabric 2, and this fabric is generally tempered with, or what characterizes it is it's tempered with chamot, which is the ground up pottery that we find. And this is actually a very good example of it, because here you can see this light stripe here would actually have been the surface of a sherd, whereas the darker material behind it is the fabric body. So yeah, once again, fabric 2 generally fired quite well and tempered with chamot. That is our most common fabric. Whenever we look at Cebuge, the pottery repertoire is a lot more diverse than the previous 2 phases. So there are 7 distinct styles of pottery recorded. We have the one that is similar to the Trefontaine pottery of Sicily. Then we have a sort of fine grey ware, and this is a very common fabric that is used or appears in Cebuge. We then have this fine yellow ware, which tends to have very yellow surface and is often quite highly decorated. Then we get the painted ware, which has a thick plaster-like surface, and it's painted. This is the first sort of evidence of painted decoration that we have in Maltese pottery. Then we have the peregrine ware, which is generally regarded as being a very coarse cookware. We also singled out the funerary ware just to get a better look at its fabric. And then we also have a sherd, which is potentially Sicilian. So as you can see, this one is similar to the Trefontaine-esque sherd, but it has the sharper, more defined triangular motif with the cross hatching. So this one is probably, well, we think it's probably Sicilian in origin. So as we can see, whenever we try and relate the fabrics to these, the Trefontaine ware, the peregrine ware, and the Sicilian sherd all are associated with only one type of pottery. And then the other ones are associated with multiple different, associated with multiple different fabrics. So generally the fine ware accounts for quite a lot of these. So we see it in the fine grey ware, the yellow ware, and the funerary ware. Okay, just rush through this. And then once again, whenever we try to associate with fabrics with the different forms present in the sebouge, obviously the sebouge has many more forms than the previous ones, and fabric 2 is the one we find with the widest range of forms. And then unfortunately the other pots, we had some difficulty identifying them with very many. So the sort of fine stuff that was made for the Trefontaine is associated with these sort of bowls. And then we have the peregrine ware, which was that very red fabric, the 2.1 that I singled out at the start. And it's, although we couldn't directly associate it with a form, generally the peregrine ware is believed to be this sort of lidded jar. So we're probably looking at something like that. The sebouge fabric distribution, according to the samples, of course, once again, it's probably quite different if you took in all of the samples, but what we have is the fabric one occurs in both islands, as does the most common chamotte ware. The peregrine ware, the very distinctive pinky red ware, we find on samples from Tachaila and Tahajarat. Then the calcite ware, which is, we didn't really find very many examples of this. It was confined to Scorba. The sherd that looks like it has the Sicilian decoration on it is the only one that uses fabric 4, and we find this sherd at Santa Verna. We also find the Sicilian sherd, it's quite interesting to note, beside a lot of the Trefontaine-esque sebouge pottery at this site. So they basically came from similar context or same context. And then the fabric 5, which is a courseware, we have only so far identified it to Santa Verna. So that's a bit of a gallop through just the different fabrics. So is there anything that we can actually then say about these? Well, what we have is, or what we have now is, a more nuanced picture of the fabrics used by the early Maltese potters. And what we can see is a number of different pottery fabrics were used during each of the 3 different phases under examination. So we've got 5 different forms for, or fabrics for Ardalam, 4 for Scorba and 5 for sebouge. And it was also interesting to note that each phase appears to have had a dominant fabric that is used across a wide range of styles and forms. So this just basically gives you an idea of the overall appearance of these three main fabrics that occur in each of the different phases. And then while the pottery from each phase shared a number of ingredients, so basically there's very common ingredients that appear, or materials that appear in each of them. So stuff like calcite appears in basically ardelam, scorba and sebouge. Stuff like the forams appear in it. So these kind of materials are common throughout, and this is probably because they are quite prevalent in the landscape. That is provided that we can actually use the provenance analysis to definitively say that these are Maltese pots. So yeah, the ardelam phase generally, but each of the phases does seem to have an overall kind of nature and overall distinct quality to it. So what we have in the ardelam is lots of these calcarenites and calcite and biocalcarenites. So we're getting a lot of calcium carbonate materials, stuff that's derived from probably the limestones. Then with the scorba, although it does still have calcites, etc., one of the defining features of it is it contains the coralline algae, which you can see an example of here, and this doesn't really show up in the other fabrics, but it seems to be present in all three of the fine wares for the scorba phase. And then with the sebouge, its sort of distinct fabric is the chamotte. And that's what kind of defines it. So these two, their common sort of characteristics can be found within the landscape of Malta. So potentially Maltese origin, whereas the sebouge, the chamotte, is just this ground up pottery. So it was manufactured by the potters, those who produced it. And then whenever we look at the exterior, interior, we have only three styles of pottery that are really associated with only one type of fabric, although I should probably have added actually the Sicilian ware here, as it is out on its own as well. And potentially we'll have to look more closely at the potential Sicilian shirt, I should say, whenever we get our provenance results back, to see if it could actually, well, if it is significantly different from the shirts that we assume to be of Maltese origin. So I know that I'm running over probably. So finally, well, we'll briefly look at the technological choices. So we can see the tempers used by the potters. Each of the phases have calcium carbonates, and then sebouge specifically has the chamotte. These two types of tempers generally give good thermal shock resistance to wares, which would be good in something like cooking wares, but from the forms that we've looked at and are able to identify, there's nothing really suggests that a lot of the vessels, or all of the vessels, were cooking wares. So it's likely that probably these were added just to strengthen the pottery, the clay material, and to help prevent cracking during the drying and firing process. So I don't think just because they've got good thermal shock resistance doesn't necessarily mean that they're all cooking pots that we're looking at. And then if we briefly look at the firing, we can tell that the maximum temperature achieved for any of these pots was about 900 degrees. So this suggests that they were probably being fired in an open fire such as this, or in a pit fire, because really you need something like a kiln to achieve higher temperatures than that. So this would explain as well if they were just being fired in these pits or bonfires where we have no archaeological evidence for the firing process. We don't have the kilns like we would have later. And then we also have a slight thing where we briefly looked at the funerary ware. So previously, it has been suggested that the funerary ware was inferior to the domestic wares, and it was poorly fired with stony inclusions. And this is sometimes the case with funerary material, because basically it's the look of it, the exterior look, that's important. So the quality of the fabric doesn't really have to be that good, because it's not made to withstand the rigors of everyday life. So it's mainly the look of it that's important. But with our research, what we find is that the funerary ware seems to be made generally using this chamotte fabric, and it's often quite well fired up to 900 degrees. So from our shirts that we have, there's nothing really to suggest that it was that inferior. It seems to be using similar fabrics, and also can be well fired. And then finally, the shared provenance. Well, I'm definitely not going to put too much emphasis on this, because obviously we have a very limited number of sites and a very limited number of samples, which don't give a true reflection of the real distribution of these fabrics. What we do have is evidence that at least a number of the fabrics in each phase are present on both islands. So whenever we think about fabrics having, coming from sort of one source, or being a sort of a very defined idea, we can see that there's either sort of trade or movement between the two islands anyway, probably, or shared ideas about fabric recipes between the two islands. And then just to finish with further work that we have to do is basically we have done all of our XRD, XRF and EDS analysis. So at the moment we're just going through and trying to identify fabric groups through these different methods. This work has been started, and we're just trying to basically do it right, so it's meaningful fabric groups that we're getting. And then once we are once we're happy with this, then we can then start to relate it back to the petrology analysis that we already have, because it forms the core of our research so far. And then we also have to finish our provenance analysis. So we want to see if these sherds can actually be definitively identified as being Maltese, or can they be related to any of the specific clay outcrops. So we don't know what sort of resolution we're going to get. Will we just be able to say these are Maltese, or will we actually be able to link them to a specific clay outcrop? And then possibly we may be able to use some literary sources to perhaps compare our material with Sicilian clays and possibly Sicilian pottery. So it would be quite good to have a look at these. So I know at the end it was a bit rushed, but that's basically where we are with the project at the moment. I'd just like to say thank you to you all for attending, for coming to the talk, and I'd also like to thank all of our various organisations associated with this, and also I'd like to thank the European Union for the funding for the project. So I think that's me done. So if you have any questions, that'd be great.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that. It was absolutely fascinating. I'm very glad that we recorded it, so that by next week we'll have it online on our website, and people can go back and have a look at the very detailed analysis that you've given us. And it certainly is. It's certainly wonderful that we now have this technology that allows scientists and archaeologists like yourself to find out so much more than we could have known before. And the idea that, these sherds that were found perhaps at the beginning of the 20th century are now telling us so much more. They're just the sherds that keep giving, which is wonderful. I was jotting down lots of questions, but I think we're a little bit tight for time. But there are a couple of questions that people have put on the chat. So I'm going to just, if you could give very quick answers so that I'll be able to mention each of them. Felicity Devonshire from UK is asking for a clarification about the intrinsic strength of vessels, if they have inclusive material in the clay, or if they are these materials are added to the clay afterwards. Is it difficult to tell the difference? Is there any evidence of firing in ground fires? But you've just actually answered that one a little bit. But something about the strength, the intrinsic strength of the clay. Is it found naturally, or are other things added? Obviously, the chamotte would be added, but
yeah. Well, basically, I think with most pottery, what you have is the clay itself, because it is so malleable. It does tend to, if it doesn't have inclusions within it, the form, it can collapse in on itself, especially if you're building, well, all depending on the shape of the pot and the size of the pot. So generally what potters will do is they will add material to it. Sometimes it's not necessary to actually add timber, because sometimes the clay as it exists naturally may have natural inclusions in it which are beneficial, which will help strengthen it. So really, unless you clean the clay first, which would involve kind of sieving the clay, washing the clay to get the impurities out, often there'll be material in it already. But with, like I say, the pottery, if it's just the clay itself, then it is liable to collapse. So adding timber to it just strengthens it. And then it's quite difficult to differentiate between naturally occurring inclusions and your added timber. But basically, one of the things that you can do, this is probably someone like Claudio Capelli could tell you a lot better, because he has seen many thousands of examples, I'm sure. But generally, with stuff that has been deliberately crushed to be added to the timber, generally tends to have quite sharp edges or an angular form to it, whereas naturally occurring materials are more kind of eroded. And then sometimes, if you also look at the distribution of the material through the clay fabric, you'll find that certain stuff looks like it's been mixed in, or if it's evenly distributed, you can maybe see that the potter's been mixing stuff in well to kind of combine it with the clay. Yeah. So I hope that's
yeah, that's fine. Another question from Anton. How can the limestone geology of the Iblean in southeast Sicily affect your confidence in a local provenance of the limestone inclusions in the pottery?
Yeah, well, this is one of the major issues. So basically, we know that the geology of Malta is very similar to especially the southern Sicily or southern Sicilian geology. So the onus is on us to try and find a way to differentiate, if possible, between the two. And we've looked at the petrology analysis, and I've asked Claudio, is it possible to say that any of these sherds are definitely Maltese or definitely Sicilian? And he says from the petrology, no. So that's why we are trying to go down these different avenues, where we're looking at stuff like the elemental composition of the clays that occur in Malta. And then because the well, we're basically hoping that they will have enough information in them to be able to link them quite closely to our pottery. So there'll be a good match between the pottery shards that we found in our samples and then the clay outcrops on Malta. Whether this is going to be possible, we don't know, but we can only see. And of course, the Sicilian factor does complicate things a lot. So there may be possibilities of us looking at some Sicilian clay outcrops to see if they differentiate or any different, if we can sort of differentiate them from the Maltese ones, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Just one more question. I'm going to send you the chat so that you will be able to answer, perhaps if you would be kind enough, the other questions, because there are several others, but unfortunately we don't have time to do them live now. But Gillian is asking, did you identify any iron-based inclusions in any of the pottery, such as magnetite?
Yes, we did actually. Whenever we went through the EDS, one of the things that we noticed is that we would get these very white, bright spots. So often they were very, very tiny. And whenever we targeted in, so we used the EDS, we selected these areas, so we targeted in on them. And those came back as having high concentrations of iron. We then also use the XRD to see if there was any iron present, and often we get hematite and magnetite present within them, and also some of the forams, the foraminifera, which occur within the pottery. Some of them even have pyrite in them, which has an iron component to it. So yeah, and some of the shards, unfortunately, I don't think there's any examples of it in the ones that I have on the presentation, but you do actually get quite large sort of iron nodules which are present in the fabric. So we have actually found quite a lot of evidence for iron within the pottery.
Well, I'm just going to sign off and stop the recording, and then if anybody wants to hold on after the recording to continue our chat, I mean, that's if you'll be kind enough to hang on, we can continue the discussion. At this point, I'd just like to thank everybody for participating in this evening's event. We look forward to seeing you again next time, when Rebecca Sherry will be giving a talk entitled A Historiography of Maltese Catacomb Study from the 16th Century to 1899, and that'll be on the 21st of April at 6 p.m. as usual. If any of you are interested in finding out more about the ASM, please do visit our website at www.archsoc.org.mt, and if you want to, you can actually join up. You'll be supporting the Society in its lecture program, its peer-reviewed journal, which is now up and running online with full versions of the texts of each paper. And you'll be helping us also in our advocacy work in support of all things archaeological in Malta. So sincerest thanks from the ASM and the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Malta to Catriona Brogan for her very, very stimulating talk tonight. And we really look forward to seeing you all at our next event. Thank you, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. And I hope that next year we'll be able to make a bit of noise to celebrate St. Patrick's, because this one's been rather a silent celebration. But thank you all.